Campus and open up its doors to the community at large, and we started organizing panels to discuss many hot topics like the constitutional amendments, the organization of political parties by young people, by youth, how to market and campaign, how to organize for the parliamentary elections, how to combat corruption. We covered over 20 topics so far, and today is a new guest and a new topic that we are very much pleased to have with us, Dr.David, Malone, and he's going to speak to us about a very interesting topic, very relevant to what Egypt is going through right now. What might we think about development and development at large? This is the puzzle that we are trying to solve here in Egypt. After so many decades of studying and talking about development, it seems we are still at the dead end at the current point in time, not knowing where to go and how to proceed with development. So we are here to listen to the experts. Dr. David Malone is a career foreign service officer and a scholar. He is the president of Canada's International Development Research Center, one of the world's leading institutions in the generation and application of new knowledge to meet the challenges facing developing countries. He started this job in 2008. IDRC funds applied research by researchers and innovators from developing countries on the problems they identify as crucial to their communities. It also provides technical support to researchers. Previously, Dr. Malone served as Canada's High Commissioner to India and non-resident ambassador to Bhutan and to Nepal from 2006 to 2008. Prior to that, from 2004 to 2006, he was Assistant Deputy Minister in Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. He was responsible mainly for Africa and the Middle East, and then later for global issues, in which portfolio he oversaw Canada's multilateral and economic diplomacy. Other posts he has had included President of the International Peace Academy. He was also Director of Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, the Director General of its Policy International Organizations and Global Issues Bureau. Earlier, he was Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations. He is a graduate of the Université de Montréal, also a graduate of the American University in Cairo, where he studied Arabic here many years ago, and of Harvard and Oxford universities. He was a guest scholar in the Economic Studies program of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., a visiting professor at the University of Toronto, a guest scholar of the Economics Department of Columbia University. He taught as an adjunct professor of international relations in Columbia University's SEPA School in 1991 and up to 1994. He's been a senior fellow in the University of Toronto, appointed as adjunct research professor Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, Ottawa. He has published extensively. Just a few of his publications include decision-making in the UN Security Council, the case of Haiti in 1999. He also has a book with the title Greed and Grievance, Economic Agendas and Civil Wars in 2000. unilateralism and U.S. foreign policy, from reaction to conflict prevention, opportunities for the UN system, the UN Security Council from the Cold War to the 21st century, the international struggle for Iraq, Iraq preventing a new generation of conflict. In 2011, an interesting title for a book on Indian contemporary foreign policy, Does the Elephant Dance? Contemporary Indian Foreign Policy, and his latest, most recent publication in 2012 is a co-edited book with the title of Nepal in Transition from People's War to Fragile Peace. Welcome, Dr. David Malone, and we would like to hear from you and understand more about development, and then later we will open the floor for questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much, Laila. Now, I have a very loud voice, so I may be able to do without the microphone. Can people in the back hear me? If not, okay, good, because I prefer not to use it.
Do you need the mic for recording? Do you need the mic for the recording? No?
If not, don't worry, or I'll leave it here. Perhaps they'll pick me up. First of all, I'm delighted to be back at AUC. I was here 3 years ago, and after some thought, I decided to speak about agriculture in Egypt. Why? Because I used to know something about it, and then for 30 years I knew nothing new about it. So it was a great deal of fun to research it and see what had changed in agriculture in Egypt. And contrary to what most Egyptians think, a lot had changed in those 30 years. And so that's the fun of research. You think you know something, you do some research, you discover you knew nothing, and you were wrong about everything. That's why those of us who do research really enjoy it. So very happy to be back here on this splendid campus. When the plan was mooted to build a new campus, many of us old-timers were very reserved about it because we liked our own old campus by Tahrir Square. But as events turn out, the move was probably very, very well timed, and the university still has its old campus, so that is good. Laila mentioned that the International Development Research Center is a funder of research in the developing world. You may be surprised to know who the principal funders of development research are. Thank you. They are led by a funder that didn't exist 12 years ago. The Gates Foundation is today the biggest funder of development research by far in the developing world. The second largest you'll be not surprised to hear about, the British Development Ministry, which has doubled its budget for development research funding in the last 3 years to about $600–700 million now, which is serious money for that type of research. And IDRC is the third, quite a bit smaller than the first two. What's interesting about development research funders is in the old days they tended to act alone and to have their own portfolios. But perhaps partly due to the ambition of Bill Gates to achieve as much as he can with his charitable funding, the larger funders have started working with each other so that we can leverage quite a bit more money for ambitious objectives. And so IDRC works a lot with the Gates Foundation, with the Hewlett Foundation, with the British Development Ministry, and with other big funders of development research. We've been quite active in Egypt historically, although I have to say less over the last 10 years. And we have been frequent funders of research at this university over the years, currently particularly in the field of gender. And we hope to do more in the future. Now, those of you who are alert will have noticed that I used to teach in the university where a much more distinguished academic, was the current president of AUC, Lisa Anderson, who became the dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and she was a wonderful dean. We all really, really liked her, and so I'm particularly happy to be back in her institution. Now, on to my topic, development. Development has woven in and out of my life, because although I was born in Canada to parents who were Australian and Canadian, very rapidly they went to live in the developing world, such that by the age of 8, I was living in Iran. And I'm going to mention 2 experiences with development that have marked me very deeply personally before moving on to some more generic provocations. The first one related to Iran. When my parents moved there in 1962, the ruler of the country, the Shah, having been effectively thrown out of his country by the government in the early 1950s, restored by the British and the Americans to power, did conclude that he must have been doing something wrong. So he tried something very different, and something that was much applauded internationally. He put Iran on a forced march towards Western-style modernization. He poured money, oil money, obviously, into various projects, including the emancipation of women, who were not hitherto particularly involved in Iran's formal economy, onto a path that, as I say, was widely applauded by the World Bank, by the UN, by everybody, in fact. Everybody thought the Shah was doing the right thing. There were only a few dissident voices, and in the academic world they were dissident voices of a very few French and Iranian sociologists and anthropologists. And they kept saying that, in fact, Iranian society was under great stress, that this accelerated modernization on a Western model was making rural areas in Iran very unhappy, and was making the poorer cities and the poorer parts of richer cities also unhappy. Nobody paid any attention why. They published in obscure journals that nobody read, and anyway, their message was dissonant. It wasn't the dominant narrative. We all know how that story ended in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. We were then able to go back and read the writings of these Iranian and French sociologists and anthropologists and realize that they were right all along and that everybody else was wrong all along. And that's my central point. When there is consensus on something to do with development, always worry and always be on the lookout for any dissident voices, because there's a good chance that they will be right, and secondly, they will always be somewhat interesting, at least. The second experience, by the time of the second experience I mentioned, I was living in Egypt, and Canada had a very large aid program in Egypt at the time, and we also had a very large aid program to the south in Sudan. And there was nobody really from the bureaucracy in Ottawa keeping an eye on the aid program in Sudan, which was being implemented by a variety of international organizations and NGOs. And so Ottawa asked me to keep an eye on it, and I was delighted because it gave me an opportunity to get to know a country which, like Iran, I grew to love very deeply. And it gave me an opportunity to see the aid business, so to speak, at work, which I hadn't really had much experience of. We had 6 very ambitious projects, spending about $30 million a year. That was real money back then, nearly 40 years ago. And they were in varied areas: forestry, dryland farming, road building, the sorts of things that the international development community felt at the time were extremely useful to virtually any country. 20 years later, I went back to Sudan, and there wasn't a trace of any of our projects. No trace whatsoever. After all that money spent, after the effort that went into planning, after the involvement of many Sudanese individuals in these projects, they had disappeared without a trace. And thinking about this, I concluded that they had disappeared without a trace because they were what the international development business thought would be good for Sudan. They weren't really what the Sudanese were interested in. Sudan is a fairly pastoralist country. That's the dominant livelihood, particularly in northern and central Sudan. And frankly, the cattle weren't much impressed by the roads, by the forestry projects, and by the dryland farming, although they may have eaten some of the produce. So we got it comprehensively wrong with the best intentions. And that also was a useful early experience in my life that I only later learned the end of. I don't want to leave you with the impression that development itself is an illusion. That would be completely false. Because if you look at indicators like international literacy rates, they've rocketed up over the last 50 years. If you look at international health indicators, particularly within the developing world, they have improved tremendously, not uniformly and not evenly across complaints, but improved tremendously, and for overall proof of that, we have much increased life expectancy nearly everywhere. Development does occur, but it occurs in mysterious ways that defy design and that surprise us. Development never occurs according to plan, particularly if the plan is an international plan. If the plan is an internally generated plan, sometimes it works quite well. Ask Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore. He made a big success of what was a small and extremely impoverished fishing harbor when he became Prime Minister of Singapore in 1960. I think if the rest of us had been in charge, probably Singapore would still be a very poor fishing harbor in the Strait of Malacca. So what I'm trying to do is to suggest that the claims of those working in international development are very often overstated, overreaching given the capacity of international actors in development to affect outcomes on the ground, and suggest that we need to be very skeptical about these claims. And one of the things that worries me in North America, in Europe, is that there are growing numbers of programs on development studies that promote the idea that the rest of us can be extremely useful in making development happen. Perhaps that's true, but perhaps equally it isn't true at all. Now, one default reaction of large institutions is to try to identify a single recipe to address a single problem that manifests itself in many countries, many regions, many parts of the world. So, poverty, for example. You might take an international institution, a regional development bank, some UN agency, some more local agency, and often its economists and others will be furiously trying to figure out what the magic recipe is going to be to achieve success in the fight against poverty in the region, in the countries, in the continents for which they may be responsible. But the reality actually defies the notion that uniformity can work. And to illustrate that, I'll talk briefly about China and India, and how their development tracks were completely different after the economic reforms that allowed both of them to start succeeding. The Chinese economic reforms started about 10 years earlier than the Indian ones. Deng Xiaoping came to power after a brief power struggle in China following the death of Mao. And having been a victim himself of Maoist excesses, he was fairly skeptical of ambitious projects directed from the capital at unsuspecting populations, which in the case of the Great Leap Forward probably took somewhere between 40 and 60 million lives because of misguided ideas about agriculture that Chairman Mao nourished. He always presented himself as a peasant. He thought that made him an expert in agriculture, and the result was not good. But when Deng Xiaoping became leader of the country, he understood that feeding China was the most important thing, having lived through major famines in China during his lifetime, several of them caused by the Communist Party leadership. For him, the most important thing was feeding the people. So he called together a group of experts, and far from having a plan, he said, "We will have no plan. Our plans have not worked. We will make it possible for the peasants to do what the peasants think they should be doing. Our job is to do that and observe the peasants and the results for 2 or 3 years. If we're very lucky, they will remember what their grandparents used to do, and that may be more successful. Or their intuition may lead them in the right direction if memory doesn't, because what we have established is catastrophic policy in Beijing." And that's what happened for 2 or 3 years, to the extent that Beijing could, and it had a lot of reach into the remotest parts of China. It was made possible for the peasants to experiment with different crops without having to be part of some vast collective. They were allowed to do on their land what they thought would work best. It was only after 3 years that Deng Xiaoping felt that Beijing was in a position to start drawing some conclusions, which led to very different policies in different parts of the countries, in different terrains. And of course, you can imagine what the result was: vast increase in agricultural production in China, such that, of course, there has never been a famine again in China. And also, China, while a net importer of quite a bit of agricultural produce, is a net exporter of many other forms and is roughly in balance on agricultural production and need and food security in China. So that's how the Chinese reform started. And then the Chinese moved on to industrialization with an export model. The idea was to fabricate, export, and enrich oneself. But the view in Beijing was, and still is, that to be successful at the game of export-led industrialization, you have to have exceptional infrastructure to move your products to market. You have to be able to get them across your country into ports that work, onto international trading networks that will work for you. All of this was done, particularly, of course, the infrastructure in China, which is pretty impressive by any standards. Services, on the other hand, China was not convinced was their particular strength. And so China on services has been largely absent in action, so to speak, on the services front. Although the city-state of Hong Kong tells you how good the Chinese can be at services if they turn their mind towards it. It's just they haven't particularly done so far. India, the first thing to be said about India was it was left in terrible shape by the British colonists in 1947 when they withdrew with their tail between their legs. Their parting gift to India had been a famine in Bengal, which they didn't cause, but which they also failed to prevent in 1943, taking about 3 million lives in a very small part of India. They were exceptionally negligent administrators when it came to Indian subjects and rapacious exploiters of India for the benefit of Britain. All you need to know about the British project in India was when the British arrived, India was contributing about 15 to 20% of global output. By the time the British left, India was contributing less than 2% to global output. That's really all you need to know about the Raj, although the romance of the Raj is fun. The reality was a lot less fun for the Indians. So India in very, very bad shape, economically flat on its back. A number of visionary politicians come to power in India. You've all heard of Gandhi, who wasn't in political life, but he was in the background. Prime Minister Nehru, one of certainly the 5 or 10 greatest politicians of the 20th century, and a number of others struggled. And actually they took a number of very bad decisions, except that they also tried to keep the country afloat on food security, but they kept it afloat by accepting American food aid, as Egypt used to. The famous PL-480 program was much more active in India than it ever was in Egypt. And that was essentially Indian agricultural policy for about 30 years. Industrial policy, unfortunately, Nehru had taken from the experience with colonials a profound anti-imperialist bent, and without much knowledge, a sympathy for socialist ideals, if not socialist methods. But alas, he adopted a socialist policy towards Egypt's economy, and this worked very badly on industrialization, because India tried to go the route of Soviet heavy equipment driven industrialization, which never worked out. And increasingly, India's very dynamic private sector was marginalized, as happened in Egypt after 52 and 54. And you pay a very, very big price for that. India paid a big price, and Egypt paid a big price. What happens? The private sector moves somewhere else. In the case of India, it moved to Malaysia, Indonesia, and other places where it did very well. And in the case of Egypt, it moved all over the place, including to the benefit of Canada. So these were mistakes that were fashionable in the 1950s in the developing world, but that doesn't make them any less mistakes. How did Indian reforms come about at all with this rather dire picture? Well, by the 1960s, India had a more autocratic prime minister, Indira Gandhi. She disagreed with the American government on Vietnam and much else, and she finally decided it was humiliating if you were having disagreements with the US to take its food aid. So she wound up listening to international and Indian scientists who told her that it was possible to bring about a green revolution in India if science was brought into the equation. And so it was, and a green revolution came about in Egypt, driven primarily by Indian scientists, in India, driven primarily by Indian scientists, but it had unintended consequences which haunt India today. One was it was powered by unsustainable use of water, as much Egyptian agriculture is today powered by probably unsustainable use of water, and also by the excessive use of chemical fertilizers, which, when used in excess, become toxic to the soil. And so the soil is much impoverished in India compared to what it used to be. But So India really did start with agriculture also. In 1990, it went broke. Couldn't pay its bills, its international bills. Classic balance of payments crisis. And only then did the politicians in India, democratically elected, who'd been having fun in parliament, only when the country was broke did they decide that something needed to be done about the economy. And so the current Prime Minister of India, Dr. Singh, was appointed finance minister, and he made some very modest economic reforms that made it more easy for the private sector to thrive, made it more easy for foreign actors to become involved in the Indian economy, took a few other steps that were really not particularly ambitious, because the Indian politicians wanted reforms as unambitious as possible. But it was enough to unlock the genius of the Indian private sector. It was enough to unlock the interest of the rest of the world in the Indian market, a market of 1.2 billion people, such that within a few years, countries like the United States were trying to figure out, now, how do we do business, serious business, with India? It became actually a central objective of America, Inc., to break into the Indian market, because it was so important. And how did all of this come about? Full circle, services. The Indian private sector decided that the infrastructure was terrible, there was nothing much to be done with industrialization, but that services, particularly IT-related services, were a possibility, and we know the rest, with India becoming the home of many of the jobs that left the West for Asia, and Indians displaying a singular talent for service-related work, including a lot of the back office work of international banks and so on. So you see the two projects of India and China, both leading to very high levels of growth on average over the last 20 years, were completely different in nearly every respect. So the idea that a single recipe is necessary everywhere is wrong, and that inspires extreme caution about international institutions, which usually have about half an idea they're trying to ram down the throat of their clients, applicable to everyone. And secondly, it also tells us that there isn't just the Chinese model and the Indian model. There are bound to be lots of other models that work quite well, and indeed there are. When you look at countries that are quite successful today, you discover there's nearly always domestic, internal specificities that any successful development policy needs to respect. There are certain idées fixes, certain givens that we think are given in our minds about development, but they turn out not always to be the case. It ain't necessarily so. So I'm going to cite a couple of examples in the field of peace and security. We believe, generally, that war must be very bad for the economy. As a generalization, it may hold in most cases, but actually there are many cases of countries that have done quite well out of war. And the most recent one is Sri Lanka, which suffered a hideous 30-year civil war, nevertheless kept on growing quite strongly during the war, and is today per capita by far the wealthiest country of South Asia. We think corruption is absolutely terrible. As human beings, we take offense. We think it must be tremendously damaging for economic development. How do we rationalize that some of the most successful countries over the last 30 years have also been some of the most corrupt? We prefer not to think about it. We prefer to remain with our convictions that because corruption is morally offensive, which it is, we should conclude that it is also economically very damaging. And please not research the subject, because we might have our certainties debunked. Finally, the general view, of course, is that violence is very bad for stability, which is then, if stability is unsettled, is bad for the economy. And in many countries that's true. But thinking of India, where I live, there are staggering levels of violence when violence is experienced in India, and India's powered right through them over the last 20 years. Some of the worst pogroms in the last 2 decades anywhere have been in India, and nevertheless, all of the violence has not disrupted the development track in India. So societies adapt, and societies are not all the same. International development assistance, aid, and I think I'll stop with it and one more perhaps positive conclusion. If you think of the countries we think of today as most successful in their development project, China, India, Brazil, let's say. Do any of us seriously think that development assistance had much to do with their success? China had no development assistance. India certainly kept the Indian mouths fed during the 50s and 60s, but once India had decided to reform itself, became broadly irrelevant because Indians powered the experience. Brazil never had much aid, and certainly doesn't have any to speak of today, and yet it's a fascinating society reinventing itself over the last 20 years, where the population is brimming with optimism, and that's a wonderful quality in any society, because optimism is often self-fulfilling as a quality. Now, my more positive conclusion, and one that's relevant to Egypt as to other countries, has to do with governance. There is no ideal governance model. China has a completely different one from India. India, parliamentary democracy along British models that works quite well. India, communist autocracy along fairly classic models formally, although the Chinese government has adapted itself considerably in the last 30 years to being much more attentive to what the population thinks than it used to be. But sustained bad governance carries a cost, and I'll conclude with a Canadian example. 115 years ago, Canada was a mildly promising country, and Canadians, congratulated themselves that the 21st century might be the century of Canada. Somehow it seemed unlikely at the time. There was a much richer country in the Western Hemisphere at the time, a much more developed country than Canada, and I'm not thinking of the United States. I'm thinking of the country at the very other end of the Americas, Argentina, which was the most sophisticated country in the Americas in many ways, and much more developed economically and socially than Canada was. By the way, the first 30 years of Canada as an independent country was a story of tremendous, prodigious corruption, which we later graduated away from. Well, what happened? Why is Argentina today so far behind in the league tables, and Canada, while disappointing relative to its potential, near the top of the league tables? It was a series of incompetent military dictatorships followed by incompetent civilian populist regimes that have done in Argentina. So I'd say governance matters, but every country has to find its own positive governance model. Canada, like India, adopted its from Britain, and it's worked fairly well for us with exceptions. I'll stop there, Laila, having gone on for much.